Hello, students. The 19th century was a time of massive change. Think about it. Because of industrialization, cities were growing, factories were being built, and life was changing very, very fast. But alongside all this, another quiet revolution was happening. And this one was all about education and the power of the printed word.
So this brings us to a very big question. Just imagine for a moment what happens when millions and millions of people learn how to read, all around the same time. What kind of books would they want? And more importantly, how would this new skill change their lives, their ideas, and the world around them? Well, let's find out.
All right, so here's how we'll explore this topic. First, we'll look at why the world was ready for this reading explosion. Then we'll meet the new groups of people who started reading. After that, we'll explore both the excitement and the fear that this created. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the lasting impact of this print revolution.
So, to understand this reading craze, let's first set the stage. We need to see what the world was like right before everything changed. The conditions were just perfect for something big to happen.
By the late 18th century, thanks to the spread of schools set up by different churches, literacy was on the rise all across Europe. In some parts, the literacy rate was actually as high as 60 to 80%. This meant there was a huge population of people who knew how to read, but they didn't really have a lot of books available to them. Not yet, anyway.
This huge hunger for reading material created what historians now call the reading mania. And it wasn't just a small increase in reading, it was a craze. Suddenly, it seemed like everyone wanted to read, and printers were working overtime trying to produce more and more books to meet this demand. Reading was no longer just a hobby for the elite, it was becoming a part of everyday life for so many people.
So, this reading mania meant that there was a whole new audience for books. But who exactly were these new readers? Let's take a closer look.
For the very first time, publishers started to think about three major new groups of readers. These were children, women, and the working class. Now, each of these groups had very different tastes and interests, and the world of publishing grew to cater to all of them. With primary education becoming compulsory in the late 19th century, a massive market for school textbooks opened up. I mean, all those children needed books to study from, right? A special press just for children's literature was even set up in France. Publishers also started printing old fairy tales and folk tales like the ones collected by the famous Grimm brothers in Germany. They would often edit the stories to make them more suitable for children, creating the classic versions that many of us know today. Women also became a very important audience. Cheap publications like the penny magazines you see here were made specifically for them. They were filled with stories and even useful advice on things like housekeeping. But women weren't just reading, they were also writing. Famous novelists like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters created a new kind of female character in their books, a woman who was strong, intelligent, and had a personality of her own.
The desire to read among the working class was also incredibly strong. Just listen to this quote from Thomas Wood, a mechanic. He talks about renting old newspapers and reading them by the light of the fire because he couldn't afford to buy candles. Imagine that. Lending libraries became very important for workers, artisans, and clerks who wanted to borrow books. And as their working hours became shorter, many used this new free time for self-improvement, reading books and even writing about their own lives.
Now, this sudden flood of new readers and new ideas was seen in two very different ways. For some, it was a sign of progress and enlightenment. But for the people in power, well, they were quite scared about losing control.
You see, print was suddenly everywhere. It wasn't just in books anymore. Advertisements were plastered on walls, in public transport, and at railway stations. It was impossible to escape, and this meant that the ideas being shared in print, whether they were in books, newspapers, or posters, had a huge and unavoidable impact on society.
And not everyone was happy about this. Many reformers believed that reading would spread knowledge and help free people from oppression. But religious authorities and monarchs saw things very differently. They were afraid that if ordinary people started reading and thinking for themselves, they might start questioning authority. They feared this would lead to rebellions and a complete breakdown of the traditional social order.
This anxiety can be seen in images from that time. Take a look at this woodcut. It shows something that would have been considered very shocking back then. A man is playing a veena while a woman is smoking. This was meant to show the fear that new ideas from books would turn traditional family roles completely upside down, leading to what they saw as chaos in society.
So after all the excitement and all the fear, what was the final outcome? What is the lasting legacy of this incredible print revolution? The most important takeaway is this: reading became democratized.
That's a big word, but it simply means that reading was no longer a privilege reserved only for the rich and powerful. For the first time in history, ordinary people, children, women, workers, could use books as a tool for their own education, to express themselves, and to fight for social change. Society was truly transformed forever. Of course, none of this would have been possible without technology. Throughout the 19th century, printing just kept getting faster and cheaper. First, presses were made of metal, which made them much more durable. Then, Richard M. Hoe perfected the power-driven cylindrical press, which could print thousands of sheets per hour. Later, the offset press allowed for printing in multiple colors. And by the early 20th century, electrically operated presses made printing even faster, really fueling this reading mania.
And that brings me to a final thought for you to consider. Back in the 19th century, many people were worried that cheap books would spread rebellion and corrupt people's minds. Today, we often hear very similar arguments about the internet and social media, don't we? It really makes you wonder, are our modern fears about new technology all that different from the fears people had about the printed word over 150 years ago? It's something to think about.